Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with lies they eat like comfort food, to disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims? Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace, but ilkas and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible, holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal to have to prove a claim you make, and folks really feel ashamed expressing content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes, it's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road of reason. Stay strapped with logic and facts. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact to help the truth grow. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road of reason.
Hi, welcome to Road to Reason.
Hi.
I'm Allison Dunleavy. This is my co-host Rick Wingrove, and our guest today, John Flannery.
Thank you.
Yep. We'll go into more depth about John and his background in a few minutes, but we just wanted to go over some news first. We have a graphic, a map I wanted to show you from the International Humanist and Ethical Union. There's a new campaign to end blasphemy laws across the country. I think everyone's aware now of what's happened in Paris with the attacks at Charlie Hebdo, and the blasphemy laws. In a lot of countries, you can be put to death. And there's actually, you see the black areas is where there's death sentences for blasphemy, and the red is prison. Luckily in the US, we're protected by the Constitution and free speech, which actually is going to play into a little bit of what we're talking about today.
Right.
Because I think we'd all be dead or jailed.
Oh yeah, we'd be
in most
dead.
countries. Yeah.
Yeah,
we couldn't do that. Even in Ireland, I think there's blasphemy laws on the books that we couldn't have a show like this.
I think they're trying to get rid of those now, though. I think there's actually a move on to
get rid of it.
Get rid of those.
That would be
and
nice.
Of course, the First Amendment has worked great for atheists in this country,
so funny,
especially lately.
But I feel like some people forget there's a First Amendment and they think there's just a Second Amendment.
Well,
like gun rights, yeah, Constitution, and it's like, what about free speech? Oh, you know.
What's the guy's name? The Catholic League, forget his name, who agreed with the Pope that you just can't do blasphemy. It should be punishable.
Yeah, you shouldn't murder people, but
you shouldn't.
If they offend your religion,
if they're talking bad about the baby Jesus, you got to kill him. Or Prophet Muhammad.
Any of them.
Pointing out the pedophilia aspects that they don't like to bring up.
I think you're supposed to cherry pick it. Like the Constitution, like they do the Bible. You just cherry pick the parts that work for you, and then the rest of it, if you try to enforce it, it's like, you're so mean. Why are you atheists so mean?
Well, plus that's a lot of reading, too. So.
Well, that's true. That would take more than showing up at church on Sundays to actually have a good grasp of either document. So, related to that, I wanted to talk about briefly these latest measles outbreaks all over the country, because we have these anti-vaxxers who, a lot of times they're allowed to get exemptions on religious grounds, which makes me nuts, because in my public school, I don't know who's been vaccinated, who hasn't, and because of privacy laws.
Well,
and
this is
I'm putting my children at risk potentially because these people can opt out based on their religion.
Well, it's sad it had to happen, but it's finally blowing up in their face. Anti-vaxxing is just irresponsible in the extreme.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid in school 100 years ago, you actually had to have your vaccinations to go to school. You had to prove you had your vaccinations. And I don't know how that ever changed, but now those chickens are coming home to roost.
All right.
And so.
Well, hopefully we
had
can
to
change
happen.
that.
Hopefully not too many people die at the hands of idiot anti-vaxxers.
I feel like if you want to practice your religion, do it. But then when it starts affecting me and my children and my health and society, that's when we have to draw the line.
And to do it on just bad information, too.
Right.
They're just wrong. It's just
Dr.
simple as
Jenny
that.
McCarthy said that autism is caused by vaccinations, which Penn and Teller did a great bit on that. I don't know if you all saw that with the bowling pins showing vaccination.
Yes.
Even if that were the case, which it's not, it still does not excuse not vaccinating your children because of herd immunity and the importance of that.
Yeah.
So, anyway, that's the rant for today.
Okay.
Glad
I could help with that.
Yeah, thank you for your help. Our guest today is John Flannery. He's a
Nice
local.
to be here. Thanks for
Thank you
having
for
me.
joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, this is just a little local show. Mr. Flannery gets to go on Fox News.
I'm part of their fair and balanced equation.
Yeah, John is a frequent guest on Fox News. Is it Flannery or O'Reilly that you go on?
I've been on O'Reilly, and they have me in the
Flannery,
afternoon shows.
Who did I
Hannity.
mean to say? Hannity.
All Irish. No, I've never been on O'Hannity.
Oh, that's okay.
And
Hannity.
well, but I don't know how you judge the spectrum of reasonableness, but Hannity is the least reasonable. It's one thing if you bring on several guests that you're going to get into a food fight with, but he's just so far out there. He's never had an inclination to invite me, and I'm just as glad about that.
Well, that is his reputation. He was recently voted the worst host on Fox, and that's saying something.
The worst
See,
host
Megyn
on the
Kelly
worst
and
network.
O'Reilly
Yeah.
may not agree with me, but they usually give me a chance to express my opinion before they pounce on me and interrupt me. So,
Now, it's important to know also that John Flannery is also a constitutional scholar, so may bring a little heft to this conversation. And as a personal matter, full disclosure, not that disclosure is called for here, but interesting personal side note, a couple of years ago when I got sued, some of y'all know what I'm talking about, my lawyer is John Flannery's partner, their law firm.
That's true.
And they did such a good job that the people who sued me had to pay me. That's how good a job that they did. So.
well, you can't predict results. And as for a constitutional scholar, I do a fair amount of criminal work, and I've written a fair amount in my life, law review articles and so forth. And so a good lawyer that gets close to questions of personal liberty and freedom necessarily either develops an ability on those issues or not. And I've been lucky to have difficult cases that I've had to study and analyze, and I've written a fair amount and thought about it, and that's what got me to the reason you have me here today, because in Loudoun County we have 40% of our public schools underlined, are holding church services every Sunday and have been doing it for years.
Now, how did this first come to your attention?
I was riding toward Percival on a local Route 7, and I saw an advertisement outside the Harmony School for church services that Sunday. And I thought, well, that's got to be wrong. That can't be right, meaning I must have misread it. And I actually backtracked to go back to see it as I flew past this sign. And then I thought, well, maybe I write local editorials. Maybe I'd write a local editorial about it. And I assumed it was only that school there. And I mentioned it to some people, and they said, oh, lots of schools have it. So I called up the principal of the school. He thought it was as high as 70 or 80% of the schools were having religious services, not just getting together to say prayers or practice hymns or things like that. They were actually having religious services. So I talked to him, and he said, well, when I was in Leesburg, the principal of the Harmony School, when I was in Leesburg for 6 or 7 years at that school, we also had religious services. So I asked the school system how many schools have it, and there was an unkind resistance. We had to define our terms a little bit. What did I want to know? And they were very forthcoming, and they did it quickly. They didn't wait until the period ran out. They didn't do any of that kind of funny stuff. And that's how I found out 40% of the schools have religious worship on Sundays. So that started me off to look.
And this has been going on. This is a policy that's been in effect for about 12 years?
Oh, or more. It's hard to tell. I don't know
This
when it
formal
started.
policy, I thought I had read that somewhere.
Yeah, well, I believe it's true. That was somebody said that from the school board, and that's where I got it. And he wasn't on the school board when the rule was passed, so it's unclear how far into the past they've had this wrong-headed policy that infringes upon the separation of church and state.
And there are two schools which I'm familiar with. One which is literally right across the street from us, Belmont Ridge Middle School has services there. The Grace Chapel or something like that, which interestingly, they actually have a church elsewhere, but they're also doing it in Belmont Ridge. And, I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's the Dominion High School, Grace Chapel, I think it's called, has a church. The one at Belmont Ridge, I forget the name of it, but they're right across the street from us.
Well, the best law to define what you may or may not do comes out of New York. And I looked at YouTube, which is a great resource, about exactly this fight. And they showed a video of the church services in public school. John Jay was the name of the school. I know that because there's a school of justice in New York name that. And I don't know if it's the same school or not. They had been there for years, and the law in New York City was to ban religious worship services. And so the occasion for this news clip was that they were going to have to stop doing what they were doing. And the pastor got up there and he explained how we've been here for so many years, and we started with a few people and now we filled the whole congregation. The place was packed, I don't know, 300, 400 people. And they had 2 other churches, all because they could use the public school system. It was underwriting their ability to expand religious worship in a public school. And none of them could understand why they should stop. That was the amazing thing. And I may agree with some of the political forces, including those that are mostly found in the religious movement, which is, you know, they want freedom for government, yet they're in the public schools being underwritten by the public schools. And the Supreme Court might very well someday decide that's okay, but that is not the law today. That is wrong.
Well, it constitutes a subsidy of sorts, doesn't it? Like, why are we subsidizing the formation of religion? And if they can't afford to rent a ballroom at the Hyatt or something, why is that my problem?
Well, it's not your problem. More than that, what we found at the beginning of our government when we were writing the Constitution, but even before that, was the discrimination of a preeminent religious group discriminating against others and using the government to do that. And so Jefferson and Madison and others said, let's not have that. And they invoked principles going back, ironically, to William of Ockham, who was a philosopher we know about, who believed there should be separation of church and state. And he may have taken it even from the New Testament. It says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God.
Occam as in Occam's razor?
Yes, exactly. The same person, the same philosophy. And he was actually pushed out of the church as a Franciscan because he rebelled against Rome's excesses in terms of the palace that they created, because he believed that the model should be what Francis said, which was poverty. And so he was, of course, drum out for having 2 decent thoughts. But how that applies in America had this political tone, which is a lot of people did come here because of persecution about their religious beliefs, and they wanted freedom of that. But they found that the government, when incorporating these religions in the government was being used to discriminate against religions. And there's a famous letter written by Jefferson to certain believers that he believed they should be separate so that they weren't subject to one sect or one religion over another. And then that became established in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. You know, what freedom we had to speak, but as, or more important, they thought was to include that you would not have the establishment of religion by the government, and people could worship and be free of the government interfering. So those 2 parts together.
Were you talking about the letter to Benjamin Rush or the letter to Danbury Baptist?
Danbury Baptist.
Okay.
Yeah, where he uses the term separation.
Separation of church and state. But I love his line from the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which seems pertinent in so many cases. If I could, I just want to read this right quick. It's just a short paragraph. It says that the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who, being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and throughout all time. I love that. That's a great quote.
And when I created a report finally, when I realized how extensive this offense against a constitutional prohibition was, and I listed the quotes going from Matthew to what Jefferson wrote to our First Amendment to a Supreme Court decision which incorporates the language separation of church and state. And you often hear people object, oh, where's the separation of church and state? That's not in the Constitution. Well, it is in the Supreme Court decision that cited what Jefferson said as the rationale for it. And we've had enough cases since to explain what that separation is.
On that note, we're going to have to take a quick break before we get back to discussing that. So we're going to go to a quick break, and we'll be right back in about 2 minutes.
87.
According to a story broadcast on KOAT News 7 in Rio Rancho, New Mexico,
A local teacher has been pressured to resign over a story a student wrote about Jesus. The creative writing assignment at Cleveland High School, which led to the issue, was for students to use a character from a legend or mythology and rewrite the tale in a modern setting. One of her students met the challenge by updating the New Testament account of Jesus at the wedding at Cana. In the pupil's new version, rather than turning water into wine, Jesus distributes marijuana to the sick. During peer review of the project, one student became offended and later told her parents, who complained, and the teacher, Katrina Guarisco, found herself placed on administrative leave. Guarisco said she felt intimidated and harassed to the point where she ultimately had no choice but to tender her resignation. In a parting statement for her students, Guarisco encouraged them to remain faithful to themselves in their storytelling. "Not everyone's going to agree with you," she said, "but that doesn't make your point invalid or worthless. Tell your story." A proposed $18 million in state tax incentives, which had been earmarked to help build an ARC theme park in northern Kentucky, will no longer be made available. In a letter written by the state's tourism secretary Bob Stewart on behalf of the State Tourism, Arts, and Heritage Cabinet, the position of the government was made apparent. State tourism tax incentives cannot be used to fund religious indoctrination or otherwise be used to advance religion. The use of state incentives in this way violates the separation of church and state provisions of the Constitutional and is therefore impermissible. The group opposing the park, Ken Ham's Answer in Genesis, appears to have inspired the state's decision by altering its proposed hiring standards. The new policy dictates that only those who support a literal interpretation of the Old Testament be hired, in particular those who believe in a young earth view found in the book of Genesis. A lawyer for Ham's group, James Parsons, plans to file suit as the board had previously agreed to allow Ark Encounter to keep 25% of all taxes levied over the past 10 years. However, upon reflection and consideration of the park's overtly religious message, that offer was rescinded.
Preventing wildfires. That's all Smokey wants for his 70th birthday.
Thank you, dear. Well, you're very supple. Just like I was at your age. Back then, I was a sex expert. Used to call me the buttered biscuit. I know about birth control, too. So you can ask me anything, baby.
Bedsider.org has birth control information and a lot more. And it's...
Have you had sex in this car yet?
This is Richard Dawkins. Doing commercials is unfamiliar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humor, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait. Look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay.
Looks like it's done.
Don't let salmonella get funky with your chicken. On average, 1 in 6 Americans will get a foodborne illness this year. You can't see these microbes, but they might be there. So learn the right temperature to cook each type of meat. Keep your family safe at foodsafety.gov.
Okay. And we're back. Before we went to break, we were talking about the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. This is a brilliant piece of historic writing by Thomas Jefferson, which is the foundation for the First Amendment.
Right.
And it's incorporated in the Constitution of the state of Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. And it's brilliant. It's also on the wall of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, better we put these things on walls than some other things.
Right? So this basically led to the First Amendment. And by the way, you said something. I got to say something. Separation of church and state's not in the Constitution. Neither is capitalism. Neither is the word democracy. So let's talk about stuff that's not in the Constitution.
Well, Beard has written a thing called the Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, which is basically that the Constitution was created by those who were concerned about losing property as a result of the Shea Rebellion and so forth, and that's where our capitalism comes from. But you're absolutely right. It's not in the Constitution, but it was an element that helped determine the structure by which there'd be some regularity of contracts and courts that did not exist.
Exactly, and that's why, just because the words separation of church and state specifically are not in the Constitution does not mean that concept is not incorporated in the First Amendment.
Well, it's more than a concept. There have been wars in the Supreme Court of the United States, for instance, about what capitalism means in terms of, is it sociopathic or does it respect the rights of individuals? And I say that because of all the workplace laws that at first were rejected as violative of the contract notion, which changed after the Lochner case in the Supreme Court. Similarly, in the case of separation of church and state, you have a situation in which the very words that Jefferson stated as the reason why we have the First Amendment written the way we do was adopted by the Supreme Court of the United States, and so it is part of our law, though not found in our Constitution, but found in our law through the Supreme Court cases.
And whatever ambiguity exists, I don't think anybody could misinterpret it to state that it endorses a foundation.
What I hear a lot, though,
religion.
I think they can misconstrue it because they choose to.
Well, they choose to,
and then
exactly.
they say, this is what I hear a lot. The Constitution says freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. So it's like they're trying to play semantics and say you can choose your flavor of Christianity as long as it's Christianity.
Well,
right.
Well, one way, I'll give the devil his due, pardon the reference. If you want to say freedom from religion, you're saying that about the government. It has to be free of religion. It can't be sectarian. It has to be secular in purpose. And then there are other tests that the Supreme Court has set. So, but you are freedom to practice any religion, which is the flip side of the government intervening and choosing a winner, choosing a religion that is the religion. There are some nations in which they do choose the religions. To choose a faraway example, Bali actually has you register as one of several religions, and Jewish is not one of them. And when in Bali, I asked, well, what do you do if you're Jewish? Well, I guess you'd choose Christian. that was
close enough.
And I don't want to attribute to the government, but you see the problem when you choose a winner in a world that has many religions and has majority religions. You make the mistake that causes wars like between Great Britain and Ireland and throughout the Middle East for probably the entire existence of humankind.
Well, once you have an official religion, you must make laws to protect, defend, extend that religion.
Well, and
those get very repressive.
And the thing about the individual belief system of a person, if they believe that the government is dictating to you what will happen with your life after death, it's a terrible thing to misuse that, particularly when there are so many different religions that have a different pathway in their individual belief systems by which they achieve reincarnation, eternal bliss, a beatific vision, whatever it is they believe in. And when the government, which has just shown itself unable to do some really basic things, starts getting into people's belief systems, then they are obviously inflicting themselves on people's individual belief in violation of the First Amendment. And the separation of church and state is a way of taking the two concepts in the First Amendment. No establishment of religion, but you as an individual can believe what you want. That's the separation of church and state.
And what could be fairer than that? Everybody gets their religion and nobody can kill anybody else over it.
Well, we have people that want freedom without responsibility. They want the freedom to inflict their view on everyone else. Exactly. And you said it earlier in the broadcast when you were talking about the concept of what people should be able to do. And they don't want to recognize the actual content of a document that does protect their belief system, because the first step is the government is religious in some unspecified way. And once that happens, the next step will be, okay, so which religion is primal? Which one is the one that we follow?
Right.
And people have a whole thing, they say, oh, well, we wouldn't have ethics if we didn't have religion. Well, I'm hard to find an ethical system that comes from religion that has been beneficial to humankind. And you have religions today that say in the Christian, the Christian invocation, you have all these Christians that don't believe even on the Sermon on the Mount, that many people could agree with, you know, that they want to be violent, they don't want to help the poor, they don't want to help the sick, all of these things that supposedly bar them from the eternal graces that they would otherwise expect. And each of these religions has these contradictions, if you will, between their scripture and their practice. And what do we have? We have this division between what the Constitution actually says and what the cases say and what they want to do.
Let's talk about a specific case.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that.
All right. Yeah, we can talk about general concepts of separation for the whole hour, but let's talk about, we're talking about use of schools for worship services in Loudoun County, Virginia specifically, but state of New York has dealt with this in a case called Bronx Household of Faith versus
the Board of Education, basically.
Yeah, okay.
In New York, even when, and I'm originally from New York, and as a kid, we had, as far as I could determine separation of church and state, I was in parochial schools with Dominican nuns, and
Fordham University.
In Fordham University, the Jesuits teach you how to use your mind, and they're terrified when you do. And some of them didn't want me to go to Columbia when I did because those people are heathens down there. And
nobody knows that. So.
Yeah, it's obvious. But in this particular case, what had happened was they had been having church services for an extended period of time, and the government put in a ban on religious worship services. And the Supreme Court before that had decided that if it's just an expression of speech, if you're trying to constrain a viewpoint, that's not allowed. Now we can argue that that's proselytizing, but the Supreme Court, other than Justice Stevens dissenting, that's the state of the law. But there was no decision that involved religious worship in a public school. And New York carved that out and said that's not about viewpoint, that's about activity. And any worship services in our schools are a violation of separation of church and state, and we ban them. And they did that, and they wrote an opinion in the Court of Appeals, and it's one of the most respected courts in America, as reflected by the fact that those who tried to challenge it to the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court to consider it, and the Supreme Court said no.
The Supreme Court has declined to consider this case.
Right, and there are a whole series of reasons how the Supreme Court can consider a case, but they found none of them to apply to this decision. So the only case in the United States that says that you may not have religious worship in public schools is this case. And there was a run against the court again. This, the original opinion is 2011. There was a run against the court again in New York in 2014, and the Court of Appeals said, you know, we really meant what we said before. Nothing has changed. There is no case in America that contradicts this court. And so I said to Loudoun County, I think you should look at your practice, because you have religious worship services described as that by the people who apply. It's all in print, and you have it in 40% of the schools. In some years, you've had it in more schools than that for at least 12 years. So what you're doing is unconstitutional, and you should stop it. And the Board of Supervisors, in their expert analysis, decided once again to do something in this category that was wrong-headed, and they said, no, we're going to continue this.
Did they have in-house counsel look at this? I think I read that they said they were going to, but then Ken Reed came down from on high and said that it was okay.
Well, he introduced a resolution, and they all signed off on it, and I believe it probably had as much analysis as when you decide whether you want to have your coffee with sugar or not in the morning. And if an attorney did this, well, he didn't do his or her research. And being admitted to practice doesn't mean that you understand the law. Although in this case, if you read the decision, it's quite an expert opinion in terms of dealing with all the possible objections and all the possible reasons and why it matters to have a ban in New York, and it's persisted for a number of years, so it's not a flash in the pan decision, and nobody has yet contradicted it. Now, you talked about the Supreme Court before. Depending on the personnel on the court, our law has changed, and lawyers tend to think of, oh, the court, you know, they look at prior decisions, and you can always rely on the court, and you can predict it. Well, the reason a case gets to the Supreme Court is because it couldn't be resolved anyplace else. And people create strategies to bring it to the Supreme Court, and depending on the personnel on the court, you can get a different decision. So it's as political as every other body in America, whether it be the legislative or the executive branch, except it moves more slowly, which is better. Although the other problem is there's a drag, because you appoint a person who's on the bench for life, and so he or she may be out of date in their perception of what the constitutional law is. But despite all of those considerations, this is the law now and applies, and anybody who says otherwise has to show me some case that says otherwise, and they can't.
Does precedent in New York have any bearing in Virginia? Did Virginia judges look at this? If we hypothetically were to bring suit, would they consider that?
They'd have to consider it, because anybody who would write a brief in this litigation would cite that case if they were challenging the fact that we have religious worship services in public schools.
So do you have any plans to sue, or what's the next step?
It's sort of like candidates. I have no present plans to sue.
I have no present plans to be a plaintiff and have legal standing, having a student in this,
You have a student in Harmony, right?
My child goes to Harmony Middle School. I went and sat down with the principal on Friday.
As a taxpayer,
what did the principal say to you?
This was interesting. He said, he's actually a very nice guy.
He is a very nice guy.
This is a problem with the Board of Supervisors, with the school board. It's not the principal. He said, I just follow school policy. And he said he probably said to me the same things that he said to you.
Yeah, that's about what he said. He was very
nice. Yeah, very cooperative. And I was asking him probably the same things that you did, but I was telling him I have a vested interest. My son goes here. And
I'm a taxpayer in Loudoun County.
And you're a taxpayer.
That's exactly
I pay my taxes.
We support the schools.
Right. And I was saying, to have a sign in the front yard, it's bad enough to use the space, but then to have a sign in the front yard that says Grace Bible Church. I think we have an image of this. Maybe we could show it on the screen. You drive by, it's like you said, it's a huge sign that says Grace Bible Church. And to me, that connotes endorsement or affiliation or something. Like, why is this sign right in front of the school? It's like free advertising.
Face of it would appear to be unconstitutional.
Let me say one thing. That sign was appearing, it wasn't appearing coterminous with the services. This was advertising the services. And I drove over there to see if on Sunday there actually were church services, and I watched people go in, and they had put the sign over the church right in front of the, I'm sorry, that's interesting slip though, right in front of the school. And that is, that's one of the theories of the case that we've been talking about, that you change the space. And what you're doing is, to everybody who sees that sign then and on Sunday, the National Day of Worship, which some could say was discriminatory against some religions that don't do it on Sunday, but that aside, you're sending the signal to the community that we, the government, in a public place, are endorsing this religion. And people keep saying, what's the difference? There aren't kids in the school, it's off hours. It is the building, it is the institution, it is that you're subsidizing, not like a Petri dish, a religious belief. And when I say a religious belief, I mean all religions are accepted, although 90% of them, by my informal count, now in the school system are Christian, which probably reflects some proportion. But that's exactly the concern. That's exactly the concern in the letter to Danbury. That should be the concern today.
Well, and I was asking a friend, I was asking a friend of mine I have some Christian friends that I can actually run these things by and they don't freak out, because it's hard. But I was asking her, how do you feel about Christian churches having services at the school? She said, oh, it's fine, I don't have a problem. And I said, now what if they were Jewish or Muslim? Is that okay? And she said, yeah, well, actually, I don't know. Islam can be kind of violent. I'm not sure if I approve of that. And I said, okay, well, hold that thought. What if it was the Church of Satan? Oh, no, I don't want them in my school. And I said, why? Just because they worship a different supreme being than you do, why is that any less, have any less merit? And to her credit, she caught herself, and she was like, wow, I'm being a real hypocrite. I can't decide what religions can or can't use the space. And I'm like, this is why we separate them. Church and state should be separate. Then there wouldn't be the question of who's allowed to use a school, who can't, no preferential treatment, no establishment. Just, I had a great idea. This occurred to me. Why don't we let them have their services at Chick-fil-A? Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays anyway, right?
Well, and you make a couple of interesting points. It's also private. You could have it any place else. It's not subsidized. Yeah. I have had people say to me, well, how do you feel about the fact that the government is using a church for voting? I said, you're missing the point. The point is that's a secular function in a church which is private, which is granting that. The flip is different. It's a sectarian purpose, a religious purpose, specifically a worship purpose, not voting, that's being done in a public place. And it's almost like a Rorschach test. Some people I mentioned this to, and I asked them, informally, what do you think about it? Not conveying my thinking about it, which has been formulated over some time after doing research on the law. And there's some groups saying, well, it's fine everywhere. And the chairman of the board, of the school board, said, oh, it's all across America. And it turns out there are like 38 states that are just fine with this, by the way. But then the other people, when I mentioned it to them, they have a very similar reaction to mine. What? That's wrong. They're doing religious worship, they're having mass in our schools, and that's the dividing point. And I guess we just don't teach people enough what the principles are at law, and particularly constitutional law, so they understand the issue at all. And when you talk to them, there are some people that will never understand the issue because their confirmation bias is extraordinary. Reason doesn't come into it at all, which I guess is part of the name of your show.
The principle of separation of church and state seems to be lost on about a generation of people, and something the churches have been very successful in doing is blurring that, and science too.
Well, yes. Well, you see, you are the demon incarnate when you suggest a reason that's based on law, because a lot of people don't recognize civil law if it interferes with their appetite to do anything else. And in this case, in this species that we're talking about, it's religious belief. How dare you get in the way of God, my God, even though there might be hundreds of versions of that God.
It's God. Why can't we just do it anywhere?
And they make the argument from majority. I feel like I'm so tired of that argument, but we like it. But that's the way we've always done it. And this is like, trumps the Constitution. Well, I'm sorry, we're supposed to have a separation, but you like it, then let's just keep doing it.
Well, let me refine that from the lawyer's perspective. The reason you have rights is so that the majority can't override certain, at least minimal, dignities that you have. And one of those dignities is that the government can't force you to subscribe to one religion, can't endorse a religion, because the right that you're asserting as an individual against the majority is that you may not like my religion, you may not like my belief system, but I am entitled to have that belief system and you can't interfere with it. And they do, and your Muslim example is one, Wiccans or whatever, I might not be comfortable with those things, but if that suits you, that's fine with me, as long as your sweep of belief doesn't in some way interfere with the freedoms that I have as guaranteed, even as a minority member in a community. And we see this all the time. Women were chattels, people were slaves. We had Chief Justice Taney that thought it was fine to treat a black man as property and return him, and now we're in a different place. That's progress. But we have in America a movement to make religion a part of our government, and there have been statutes to that effect, and that's a slippery slope, and we're going to find ourselves, if we don't resist that, we're going to find ourselves like the people who war in other countries over what sacred item or belief system is acceptable or not, and that's wrong.
That's the slipperiest of slopes.
That is.
The founders knew that, and that's why it was the first thing they dealt with was the influence of religion on government, and why they wrote a strictly secular constitution. I read the decision. I actually read the whole thing.
That's good. And we're going to have to make you a lawyer,
As meager as my television-based legal education is, even I got their reasoning here. They were challenged. This has been challenged on the basis you're picking on religion. Well, they weren't picking on religion at all.
And that's the good thing about this decision. I find that if you have a discussion, a constructive discussion, that you refine the points. It's easy to say, I want X, and then somebody says something, you say, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't do this, that, and the other thing. This is a fight that's gone on for 10 years or so, or more. I'm not sure right now as I sit here. And it's gotten more refined, both the regulations to limit it, to recognize the Supreme Court case, and to deal with the violation of the First Amendment. But having said that, what is...
Well, the appellants haven't laid a glove on it yet. And they've tried 6 times now, I believe, by my reading.
Right.
But the decision is based on the fact they're not limiting any specific religion or religion in general. They're doing what they can to prudently stay away from that wall of separation. And I think they're very wise in what they've done. They're just trying not to get in that trouble. And it seems like an easy call to me that churches don't get to take over the schools on the weekends.
Right.
I mean, there's that obvious
they don't
endorsement.
take them over for worship services. The services was the key word. They distinguished services of any sort without regard to the content of the religion. So it's not restricting a viewpoint, and it's still permissible by the other Supreme Court cases. I would disagree, but this is the law, and we're only talking about the law as it is right now. And the law as it is would allow you to go in and to read scripture and practice hymns and stuff like that. And Justice Stevens may call it proselytizing, but the Supreme Court has treated it as a First Amendment exercise of viewpoint. So what the court's done is it's drawn a line between viewpoint exercises and religious worship services, that activity. So anybody who's doing worship services, that activity is prohibited in New York from using the school for that purpose.
And they call it that themselves on their applications.
That's right.
Religious worship.
Right.
But do they try to do a runaround? Is there, if you're soliciting donations, does that change the definition versus accepting tithes?
Well, the donations thing is, I mean, you could argue certainly voluntary. You could prohibit it, I suppose, for reasons other than having to do with worship services. But there hasn't been any decision on that. And so that's not a key factor or an element. It's the services themselves. And it was ironic, like the film I mentioned earlier in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Whoever put together the piece, almost always when they went to the worship services, they were all receiving communion, which is the height in a Christian service of the celebration of the religion. So you couldn't have a better example, but unconsciously, because the piece was kind of crafted to say, "Oh my God, what are they going? Pardon me, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And several of the people said, "Well, you know, that's the way. That makes sense to me." One of the parishioners said that, but the head of the church had all these contradictions. You know, they use church buildings for X, Y, and Z. It's like he still missed the distinction, or he was being political and rhetorical or sophistic, trying to mislead the public to say, I don't get it, what is it about?
Right.
But the piece did show the balanced part and cited this case and cited the history of this case, which explained why worship services are not allowed. And that's a pretty narrow line of all the things that you could claim are establishing a religion in a public school system.
It's odd they should miss that point, he said sarcastically.
Well, it's self-referent. I do believe there are people that believe the means justify the ends. We see that, you know,
because it's Jesus.
And I don't mean, well, and I don't mean to open up a whole other thing, but you've seen how pro-life people will kill a doctor who believes that a woman should have the right to choose a medical procedure that legally and constitutionally allows her to have an abortion.
Right.
And so we see more and more trying to inflict religious principles in our civil law. You know, and there are many people that are still. The next generation is going to save us, I think, from a lot of this babble.
Exactly
I really do. And you see it.
Exactly
you see it in accepting gays who want to marry, whether or not, you know, don't you marry a gay, okay?
Right.
If that's your problem, don't you have an abortion? But don't tell everybody else they can't when it's constitutionally allowed and medically supported by the information that we have to date about what it means.
The American Religious Identification Survey, which is a pretty popular read in the atheist community,
you guys, yes.
among us guys, tells us that the millennials are now about 35% no religious affiliation. That will save us.
Well, I'm not going to comment on any specific religion, but you know, Joseph Campbell was brilliant in his analysis of mythical systems and what they meant through history, all sorts of periods. And the biggest difficulty that he pointed out, I think, in our religious movements, if you will, is the relevance of, say, a nomadic experience, finding a cosmology, whether you treat it literally or metaphorically, to a modern society which is post-industrial. And he said that what we need is a myth or a belief system or a way to contain it that is relevant to us today. And there are a whole bunch of them. And religions often say, oh, what would you do? Like people would run around and kill each other if there wasn't a religion. And they ignore the fact there were all sorts of ethical systems, in fact, adapted and taken over by the religions. And the one I'm most familiar with is obviously Roman Catholic. And in that religion, they took over Aristotle and they changed him. Aquinas did that. And they took over Seneca, you know, a Stoic, and they adopted him. And these are ethical systems that pre-existed the current decisions. And then when they were incorporated by Constantine, they eliminated the pacifistic teachings of the Jesus that they believe in, because in this sign you will conquer. And it wasn't a metaphor, it meant physically conquering, killing, and destroying. And now it's okay to accept capital punishment, but not a fecundated ova. But a fecundated ova we want to preserve, and it's okay to war, even though the teachings very plainly stated you're going to hell if you believe in this.
Well,
this is the disassociation is extraordinary in religions, and that's why people like Dawkins, whom you were advertising, feels very uncomfortable with what terrible things happen as a result of religion, the things that they do in the name of religion which defy the scriptures that they have. And of course, Christopher Hitchens as well, an ironic name, bearer of Christ.
Christopher, yeah, right.
He in particular says, it's fine to believe all sorts of things you want to believe, but then implementing them and damaging people, you talked about the vaccines as an example, you talk about forcing children to have children because you withhold from them information and you lie to them because it's in the better interest and glory of God, I suppose, ad majorem gloriam. And so we have all these amazing tensions in which we're compromising people for no good reason and in violation of their own scriptures, many religions.
Well, was it Gandhi, I think, who said, I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians, they are so very un-Christ-like? And I feel like now there's like this white Republican Jesus who likes guns and he likes war and he likes capitalism, because if you look at the teachings of Christ,
well, Jesus said, bring the unbelievers before me and slay them with the sword.
Well, I think he said
somewhere.
No healing the sick if you don't have, universal health coverage.
Right,
make your copay, or I'm not going to heal you.
People are poor because if they weren't, because they're not better people. I'm sorry, I blew that whole line.
But here's the other thing. I mean, when you're a youngster and you're studying it and you read the Gospel according to John, you think John wrote this at or about the time that Jesus existed. And then you find out this stuff wasn't written down for 700 years, and there are a whole bunch of Gospels, and they don't allow the Gospel of Mary that founded Nag Hammadi in 1945, which doesn't become public for decades after that, or the Gospel of Thomas and so forth. So there was a selection process, and a good community seemed to have lost its way to survive in contradiction of the scriptures that they chose to publish 700 years after Jesus had passed.
But I don't think most Christians even are aware of like a Council of Nicaea and the fact that these were hand-picked hundreds of years after Jesus supposedly lived. And I've read there's increasing research to show he never even existed at all. This is like an amalgamation of different folklore. To me, I don't really care if he did or not. It's kind of irrelevant.
I love some of the books the Council of Nicaea left out, like Baal and the Dragon. I wish that book was in the. I wish they would include
change
that.
Our holiday celebration.
Well, as compared to the Inquisition and other things, I suppose this is a minor thing. But in terms of our civil law, this is a violation of our Constitution. And I suppose at some point I'll revisit this within the next 30 or so days with the school board and say, so are you guys going to violate the Constitution or not? And I think that there's a good chance that they will decide, like the Board of Supervisors, to violate the law, figuring, go ahead, make us abide by the law.
Exactly. In contrast to this decision where they were giving the wall of separation a wide berth, the Board of Supervisors in Loudoun County has just just pole vaulted over that thing. They could not give less of a crap about the wall of separation.
Well, it says something about the Board of Supervisors, and I'll go broader than your normal topic.
The all-Christian Board of Supervisors in Loudoun County.
That a whole bunch of them are not running again. The public may not always get it right the first time, but over time, and this was Jefferson's theory, that they can get it right. You just have to be patient. Although he did say one thing about democracy, which is a nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. And we have an epidemic of ignorance, I think, when it comes to science and certain other things. And we have people bragging they don't read, they just know viscerally. We even had a president who said he made decisions that way, George Bush.
Yeah.
So
I remember that guy.
We have, yes. Well, unfortunately, without regard to party or spectral identification, we have people in both parties all across America who make those decisions. decisions. And then we have the manipulators who will take advantage of a people's belief system uninformed by facts or scripture or consistency or ethics and say, yeah, let's go do that.
Well, it raises the troubling specter of anti-intellectualism, and we've seen historically where that goes.
Well, we've been in that place worse than, I think, in my lifetime since 9/11. You know, when you war constantly, you're always at war, then the means always justify the ends, and you make all sorts of excuses, and you demonize all sorts of groups, and you create dissension, and it becomes every human for himself. You know, you have phones, they're iPhones, right? We have iPads. Everything is I touch. You know, and
I never thought of it that way.
Well, you know, there's a book that came out years ago, The Sociopath Next Door, which said basically 5% of Americans are sociopaths. About me, it's not you. Not psychopaths, we have a smaller group of those. But I think that if you have this current culture, what happens is you lose the values. You don't care about law as much. You don't care about being friendly to each other. And like population pushing that together makes it even worse.
So
that's
like the schools, we had civics when I was in school, and I don't know if they even have that anymore. I never hear anything about that, but you'd think that would be the religion they would teach in schools.
Well, I just looked at a textbook on biology, and to see if they were teaching our kids about Darwin, and they were talking whether, and this is in Loudoun County, whether they're talking about intelligent design or creationism and that kind of stuff. No intelligent design, no creationism. And I read it, and I thought that, well, this looks fine, because I've read those books. They're fascinating. And as a kid, it wasn't taught in the schools I went to, and I saw in the Adirondacks an exhibit which showed primal beasts becoming gradually evolving to man. And then I asked all sorts of questions. That's how I discovered it. So I was thinking, well, this looks complete. And then I thought about, you know what's missing from the textbook? No connection between an evolution of mammals from animal-like or animals to human. The most significant, dramatic, amazing thing that teaches us about adaptation is missing from the textbook. So we're not talking about these things, but we're withholding from our children this very important question about Darwinism and about evolution. And we have all sorts of things now with DNA and fossils and radio dating and stuff like that to tell us all manner of things. We have telescopes out there that tell us how long the universe has been around, and we think.
This speaks of the success that the forces of anti-intellectualism, pro-religion, have had on our science. And during the George W. Bush administration, NASA couldn't use the phrase Big Bang in any of their publications. Well, and it's like if you deny it and lie about it, it doesn't exist. It goes away.
The Ministry of Truth. Like Orwell was so prescient. I think I don't know if he would roll over in his grave or be gratified.
No, he'd be going.
Well, I think he wrote it because he already saw it happening. He saw it happening. It's just gotten worse.
And in Texas right now, I think they're trying to rewrite the history books to make Jefferson and the Founding Fathers less influential, and it's more about Mosaic law. Because it's the same thing. If a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth, and if this is all the kids are learning, how would they know that that's not true?
I'm sorry, I just rolled my eyes so hard I saw my brain.
Well, a member of Congress, and I won't identify the person, who was from another state, came here and had their children in the Virginia school system, and because of things that were said about history and so forth, removed them and just commuted and had the kids stay in the home state. So we have people all across America in our schools, infecting our children with stupid things. And I look back on my own childhood, and I think it was wrong that I was told there was a fairy, and I think it's wrong that I was told there was a Santa Claus that came down chimneys. I think I should have been told it was a story, and it's like it's setting up your mind to accept unbelievable things. And I think all of that's wrong. Why aren't we more respectful of children? And I think we give them a head start when there are all sorts of magnificent things that happen in life and that are available to us. And why get them off on this side road when there are all these real things happening?
The one good thing about the Santa story, though, is, and this is kind of a common thread, I've heard this from other people, and it's true of me. The day I figured out Santa Claus wasn't real, I also realized God wasn't real.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, when we lived in I called it a picturesque tenement, an essay I wrote in grammar school. My dad said, you can't be picturesque and be a tenement. And I said, I think it is. Well, we didn't have a chimney. But I don't know if you know what a dumbwaiter is. Yes. You know what a dumbwaiter is? Sure. You used to have this thing by pulleys. You could send the garbage down through the building. So Santa came through the dumbwaiter, and I said he was too big to come out of that dumbwaiter. here. And then in my neighborhood, a kid hadn't yet figured out there wasn't a Santa, and he asked me about it, and I said, well, if you believe there's no Santa, maybe you don't get any presents.
So you ruined this guy's life, basically. That.
Well, I didn't go 100% with him because I didn't want to be offensive myself. But there's a sickness in that, you know. There's like an implicit misleading of another kid who was a friend of mine when I knew something. And as a friend, I should have just said, well, of course there's no Santa. How'd you find out? Well, my parents were up late and I saw them getting the presents ready, so Santa didn't come down the dumbwaiter, you know. And why do we tell people these things? And I guess it sets us up for governments to lie to us about what they're doing.
You know, we've got about 3 minutes left here, and just want to ask you, going forward in Loudoun County, if they persist, do we want to do anything? Do we want to sue the crap out of somebody? Or what do we want to do here?
Well, you know, what I've learned from litigation is it's better that people come to a realization themselves. And so...
And I actually agree with that.
Yeah.
Learn that lesson the hard way. I agree with that.
Well, you know, and courts are limited what they can do. You know,
well, the New
York good people should do the right thing. You know, they should respect the law. I'm not a revolutionary. I do know how to stir the waters, but my view is that that's what it says. It says it clearly, and give me some reason why it's wrong. And I can't think of one. And there are a lot of reasons why it's wrong, from a governmental, political, and constitutional and case-based reason.
There's the obvious endorsement and the obvious subsidization.
But they like it.
If I said that.
Yeah. I mean, they like it. It's just like the Board of Supervisors at Christmas time with their displays. But we like it.
I don't like paying for it, and we are subsidizing them. There's no way that $160 an hour pays for a school.
Well, you know, it goes
to be open.
The biggest obstacle, I think, is the notion that I've heard repeatedly from elected officials, including school board members, that got all upset and went on Fox TV, and they used a picture of me. All the times they've invited me, they didn't invite me to come on the show. And actually, so they had this picture of me which was more casual, you know, he's a constitutional lawyer out there. So, okay, so that's fine. But his principal argument was, we talked to lots of people and they were okay with it.
Right,
you missed the whole point of a constitutional right.
Right.
The right is that a single person in the whole universe could assert a right nobody else has and be protected if it's in our Constitution. And you can't solicit a majority. It's the same thing about gay marriage. How can they set aside the gay marriage principle because we had a referendum? Okay, we could have a referendum saying slavery is okay too, and the 14th Amendment would stop you. And then they say, well, you know, but that's only the federal government. Hello, there was a decision in the Supreme Court that said, through the 14th Amendment, privileges and immunities apply. There's not just process, there is the content of a right that's found in the Constitution that applies to the states. States, local government, federal government, all have to respect the First Amendment. And you choose to invoke it when it suits your needs and you ignore it otherwise. And I guess I'm pressing your time, so excuse me.
We got about 30 seconds.
I was going to say, have you all read this book? It's called Idiot America. I think like how ignorance became like a virtue in the land of the free.
I think I wrote that book.
Did you? It's Fox News, basically. I mean, they are the devil, but it comes down to this idea that everything is fair and balanced and that everything has two sides. You might have a JD from Columbia and be a constitutional lawyer, but Rick, you know, watches TV and he knows what's right and what he wants, and like these are not equal opinions.
Well, there's a comedian I like, Bill Burr. He says, "Don't listen to anything I say. I get all my information from YouTube, and you know, so I don't know what I'm talking about." Yeah, but at least he's a comedian.
Got to cut you off right there. We're just about done. Like us on YouTube. Watch us on Ustream live every week on YouTube a few days later, and
check us out on Facebook. Road to
check us out on Facebook and read your Bibles because there's a lot of crazy stuff in there. See you next time.
Thank you to John Flannery for joining us today.
Thank you for